Tutor. Okay, good. All right. Good day. I'm Richard Mort Morehouse, host of Talking Smart Conversations with colleagues in education and philosophy from around the world. My guest today is Professor Wayne Henry. Wayne is an associate professor, or was an associate professor at Simon Fraser University at Abbotsford since 2009, where he taught logic, history of analytic philosophy, business globalization, and sustainability. The courses that Professor Henry taught at Capella and a few of the other institutions in the Vancouver area were what sort of drove him to begin this book. The class precipitated lively conversations that allowed him to think through the beginning of this book. On a personal note, I have known Professor Henry for a number of years, mostly associated with ICPIC, the International Association for Philosophy of Children, and the North American Community of Association, the North American Association of Community of Inquiry. And we, Professor Henry wrote a paper called Consumer Madness, and Professor Susan Gardner and I were pleased to make a small contribution to that paper. There's a little bit more, but Professor Henry is now retired and living in Ottawa. So with that introduction, I guess we want to talk about your new book, which was very exciting to read and to review. And so maybe we can begin with just talking about that, because I was fascinated by this, the organization of the book. Because I think the organization of the book, from my sense, is key to understanding the nature of your argument. So if you want to talk a little bit about the way the book is organized and the content develops.
I will. Yes, thank you. And thanks for having me, Mort. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk up the book a bit. I'll just issue one correction to your introduction.
Sure.
I was associate professor at the University of Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, not Simon Fraser.
I know
Yeah,
that. I
yeah,
misread that. I'm sorry.
no worries. In any event, about the organization, I suspect what you're talking about is, and for the benefit of the readers, or the listeners rather, I'll just tell them that the book is divided into three parts. One part, which is part two, is a sustained critique of classical liberalism, which is the foundation of the view that supports an economic model of globalization, which is extractive and not sustainable. And in part three, I get into the moral evaluation, the normative evaluation of that model. And in part one, I start with what is an alternative model that could be sustainable without abandoning capitalism. And that's got a fairly well-established familiarity in the marketplace of ideas now, where it's known as natural capitalism. Hence the title of the book, A Philosopher's Guide to Natural Capitalism. Now, I suspect that what you mean when you say, the organization of the book surprised you a bit is the logical progression would start with the critique of classical liberalism, then the normative evaluation, and having cleared the deck, so to speak, by showing why that model is not sustainable, you would then move on to introduce this sustainable version. So the question becomes, why did you, Wayne, decide to start the book at the ending, so to speak? And the answer is it's partly serendipitous and partly a matter of at least two persons who read early drafts of this book suggesting it to me. And the idea was, why don't you start with the hopeful vision first and then back up and show them why we need to get there? And I've had some positive feedback since that indicates that that really was a good instinct to have. Start with the hopeful vision first, get the reader's attention on the most important point, which is that we can achieve sustainability, and we can do it without having to have a revolution or completely abandoning our lifestyles, though it will certainly require a significant reworking of the way we live our lives, but at least it would still be based in the relatively familiar model of capitalism. Start with that vision first and then move on to the critique of classical liberalism.
Yeah, that was exactly my and it was very interesting because um, that was part of what I struggled with the review. Do how to read that, and I ended up agreeing with you as well that that was a good place to begin, but it was a little I don't know, jarring at the beginning, particularly because and this is a good thing, because you did such a good job of developing Adams and
Locke?
Locke. Those I was I really was very impressed at the depth of your understanding of those two very important contributors to the basis of capitalism. And so, um, but because that was so powerful, and well written and succinct, and you got a unique understanding. I had to turn my head around a couple of times to remember the value of your introduction and that first part of the book. So, um,
Well,
so
thanks for that.
yeah, it was very interesting. One of the things that well, and the other thing that fascinated me was I think except for maybe literally almost one line, uh, there is, and I think I understand why, but I'd like to hear you talk about it a little bit. There was no mention of Karl Marx.
That's exactly right. There's only a brief mention, and I did not. Let me be clear. I don't mean to dismiss Marx out of hand, but I've always been of the view that there are two Karl Marxes. There is the Karl Marx critic of capitalism, and he's one of the best. And I do mention him briefly in connection to some of my criticisms of Locke and Smith. And then there was Locke, the socialist with a very particular program that he calls communism. And I never found that particularly plausible, not least of which because in my view, I believe it's premised on a false conception of human nature, which is that we are all I call it the noble savage view. We're all basically good until we're corrupted by capitalism. If we could be all of us be that similar and yet corrupted that easily, then there's no hope. So I've never found communism terribly appealing, though I guess I would call my own view a kind of democratic socialism, but it starts from a Lockean conception of human nature, which is that unlike Hobbes, who's at the other end of the spectrum from Marx, who believes that we are basically all of us um, self-serving in the strongest possible terms, and we're restrained only by a thin veneer of social convention, which must be supported by a very strong hand. Locke comes down somewhere in the middle between those two thinkers and seems to be saying that, well, we're not too bad. We're certainly capable of behaving irrationally and selfishly, though that does need to be triggered. Conversely, and certainly as Hume and Smith add to the story, other triggers can trigger our empathy and have us behave rationally and quite well. So it really depends on context, but we're not all the same. But the context is the thing that matters. And it's not as though we're easily corrupted or buoyed into some wonderful utopia, so much as we must recognize the diversity of human motivations and try to make it uh, we want to incentivize good behaviors and disincentivize bad behaviors. And so that's where I come down on Marx.
And just for perspective, I agree with you on Marx that he is awful at predicting the future of society and his communist ideas are not helpful. But as a critic, I like him a lot, and I always focus on the philosophical manuscript, the economic and philosophical manuscript, and
Yeah.
I have a particular section that I have almost memorized where Marx says, assumed man to be man in his relationship to the world, a human one. He says, then we can only trade what well, it ends up saying, and we can only train love for love, and if that doesn't work, then that's a misfortune, and that's for me a kind of poetic version of Marx's belief, and that all gets tangled up with his Communist Manifesto and other places like that. So,
Yeah.
uh,
I wholeheartedly agree with you. The early stuff is best.
yes,
What I call the Paris manuscripts, and then the German ideology. And after that, it it becomes a bit more devoted to the program. But those early documents, the critique of capitalism, they were so insightful, and I've drawn a lot of inspiration from those for sure. I'd want to add, by the way, just in regards to your earlier comment, first of all, thank you very much for having such a high regard for my discussion of Locke and Smith. But I was inspired on that by a book I read as an undergraduate many years ago called The Theory of Possessive Individualism by C.B. Macpherson. Though his targets were a little different, he was talking about Hobbes and I think Locke comes into a bit, but he was looking at earlier precursors. But there was that detailed, methodical dissection of their supporting theories and looking very carefully at the assumptions and unpacking what they really imply in terms of consequences. So that was my model for those chapters on Locke and Smith.
no, that's a helpful bit of history because I'm trying to do some writing again too, and it's interesting as I started to rethink what I might want to write about. I remembered courses that I had taken as an undergraduate that really were very influential, and I thought, and it's actually one of the things that I, I say it's a missed opportunity for this because one of the people was an instructor that I had at Sacramento State. Um, and I finally looked him up after all these years. And I didn't do that. And it turned out that he died probably about 5 years ago. And I just really wish I would have contacted with him and told him about that. Because the book
Yeah.
that I think it was called Consciousness and Society by H. Stuart Hughes. That it was a really powerful critique of the 19th century sociologist, and it was very, and it kind of that point by point thing that you're talking about. So I guess with that in mind, let's do the other thing. Let's talk a little bit about the natural capitalism and exactly what that sort of means to you and what you, in a shorthand way, developed in the book.
Yeah. So natural capitalism is reestablishing capitalism on the foundations of both a different economic model, and there are also some infrastructural details. But of course, the argument in my book is that none of that will happen unless we want to. And the only way we'll want to is if we first come to have a very different view of ourselves and our relation to the natural world. So a big part of the book is about establishing the need for a different worldview, a different supporting narrative, and of course, sketching out what that narrative would look like. And perhaps we'll come back to that a little later. But natural capitalism itself is, again, it's an economic model, and there are also some infrastructural details. And the infrastructural details, I lean very heavily on the work of now I'm forgetting his name. Uh, he wrote a book called Entropy, the first book I ever read by him, Jeremy Rifkin.
Oh, yes.
So Jeremy Rifkin makes the point that there's a certain kind of architecture or infrastructure. And by infrastructure, he doesn't just mean, the physical stuff. He means the institutions of society that will be required to achieve a sustainable kind of capitalism. And importantly, what that will mean is turning corporations, the corporate sector, into into a service delivery model, which is also, of course, part of the economic model of natural capitalism. So what the easiest way to understand this would be to look at utilities. So presently, utilities are built around large utility companies that build very large and expensive infrastructure projects like dams, nuclear reactors, coal-fired power generators, and sell energy to users delivered from these sites usually over enormous distances. And there are a lot of problems. First of all, the models are extractive and hard on the environment, but they're also very brittle, not least of which because those large infrastructure units, the infrastructure units themselves, are susceptible to all sorts of damage from their complexity, but there's also the brittleness of the transportation of the energy from the site of production to the consumers. And, in the book, of course, I cite a very prominent example where the entire eastern seaboard of Canada and the United States went down initially because of a tree branch that struck a line, but because of software problems, the problem very rapidly cascaded through the whole system, and the system was down for about 3 days. So the new model would reconstruct utility companies as service delivery people, and we would have the widespread democratic distribution of energy production at people's homes, businesses, and buildings. We would all of us be the generators of our own energy through a mix of sustainable means: solar panels, small, medium, and large scale wind. But each home could be engineered to be basically self-sufficient in terms of energy generation, with a mix of the right kinds of sustainable energy production and storage on site. Plus, this is the important part, all of them connected together into nodes or networks via smart meters. This is where the utility companies come in. The utility companies would be reconfigured to install the smart meters and manage the network that would manage the distribution of energy, so that when I was not producing enough at a particular time of day because of where I am, and someone else is overproducing, it could distribute within the network so that we're all getting enough. And also, they would be in charge of and would get their profits from helping all of us reduce our consumption. As the present model is not like that. They incentivize us to use more because that's how they make their money. The more energy they sell us, the more they get. So on that model that reconfigures utility companies into energy managers, we undercut one of the principal drivers of unsustainable capitalism, which is, profits are extracted by consuming more, ever more, and switch to a model that derives profits from minimizing our consumption.
Yes. No, and I think you, at least indirectly, and maybe for more directly than I can recall off the top of my head, address what I think is the real legitimate critique of why people aren't as interested in sustainability as they might be. And that is that they see sustainability as something that we have to sacrifice for rather
Yeah.
than something that we can enjoy. And so can you kind of talk about that a little bit? Because I think your model is sort of based on the idea that sustainability is not, I mean, it requires hard work and energy to get it going, but the end product isn't, oh my gosh, we're having to give up a lot of stuff in order to do this.
Yeah, if that's what's required, arguably it will never happen. People just won't buy into it. And that's was the principal reason for starting part one of the book with the hopeful vision, so that I could, basically sell people on the idea that we can have a sustainable lifestyle without giving up everything that's of importance to us. It depends on reducing our consumption, to be sure, but not in ways that would result in um, living a bare bones lifestyle. And I might add, by the way, we could expect this to result in an awful lot of production of good paying jobs I mean, in the time it would take, probably 40 years, to build out the infrastructure. Um, it would be like when the infrastructure is built out after the Second World War, there would be a lot of jobs, and almost all of it would be going to the remuneration of employees. So imagine what this lifestyle would be like. Part of reducing our consumption means reconfiguring our buildings and our homes, most importantly, to require less in the way of energy, not only by, developing models of sustainable energy production on site, but also by reconfiguring the windows and the doors and the insulation so that they need less, and reconfiguring neighborhoods so that they're less brittle, instead of living in suburban environments where we have to drive everywhere for work, church, school, home. We could live in sustainable communities that would be modeled to be integrated into nature, where they would present a less brittle front to sudden and dramatic rainfall or wind. There would be generous spaces provided for um, walking paths, cycling paths, and we would live, work, and play all in the same neighborhood. So there'd be less need to travel. All of this, of course, will take time. But when you actually look at the models of what it could look like if done properly, it would it would be a much more wonderful lifestyle than the one we enjoy now. We're often under enormous stress as we sit in our cars. The freedom of a car to go anywhere as we sit stuck in traffic, often for hours at a time.
Uh, Well, I mean, just on a personal level, we moved to the house we're in currently, which is a new built house, which has a lot of the stuff. We don't have solar panels or any of that, but it's extremely well insulated. But one of the things that it took us a long time, one of the reasons it took us a long time to find a house on one level as we age, is that we have, well, I think probably since 1980 only have one car. And so we knew that we had to have a house that was on the bus line. And La Crosse is fairly good at having reasonable translations. It's not as transportation. It's not as good as it ought to be, but I have maybe a little over half a block to walk to the bus. And that makes a huge difference because we can easily sustain our lifestyle with one car and two people sharing that car in ways that the bus is in a necessary extension of our car. So,
Exactly. Our
so
lives would be so much better, and our personal health, if we were walking brief distances to do more and only using the car when we need it to go get groceries or something heavy.
exactly. Yeah.
And if I could add to that for a moment, there was a recent book published by Bill Gates, and I'm not, I'm not slamming Bill Gates. He's a brilliant man, and the book is well worth reading. I encourage readers to read it. But he does emphasize the technological solutions to climate change. So the book is mostly about how we need to attack climate change by electrifying just about everything, the fleet and energy delivery to homes and all of that. That won't be enough. And to return to an earlier theme about the infrastructure, a lot of the enthusiasm for technological solutions, which includes carbon capture and abatement, is grabbing, in my view, it's picking up the wrong end of the stick. It would be better if we reduce the carbon consumption. We might need to engage in capture and abatement too, but let's move towards consuming less and producing less in the first instance. So to return to the earlier theme about infrastructure, the technocrats who emphasize technological solutions think that the way to go is to have more and more of our energy production sites transformed from the abandonment of the coal-fired plants to, for example, huge solar panel installations in deserts. But it's the same model. It's still a huge infrastructure development that must deliver the energy over often enormous distances to the end users. It's still built on extraction and consumption because they make money by selling more energy to users. So they want to incentivize them to use more. And it's still subject to all of the brittleness of a huge installation that could be subject to terrorist attacks or software glitches or any other sorts of fault. Whereas if homes are themselves the generators of their own energy, homes, businesses, buildings, we're all generating our own. If one house breaks down, it doesn't affect other people in the node.
Right.
There's a really it's also a way of building a lot of resilience into the energy infrastructure, in addition to all of the other benefits around reduced consumption and sustainability and the democracy of energy. Everyone becomes their own energy producer, and that's really an enormous benefit to everyone, I think.
Yeah, I agree. But let me ask a devil's advocate question. Won't the power companies have to use rather massive computer systems in order to do this sharing of information with the small individual homes and businesses, and to keep that system working effectively?
Yeah, but these nodes. Imagine a neighborhood. Let's say you've got a neighborhood of 5,000 homes, and they're connected together into a network of shared energy users, where I mean connected together, they've all got a smart meter, and the smart meter is managed by a utility company that is now a service deliverer. And the utility company, again, is working with all of those clients for example, by virtue of the smart meter, they can monitor their energy usage and tell them about how to organize their energy usage at certain times a day to reduce consumption. They can even we can turn off turn on your intelligent and Internet of Things connected washing machine, for example, while you sleep at night to use less power, or at least share the distribution of power during the day. All of that stuff is very good. But on the security issue and the point about large centrally constructed networks of computers, the individual homes themselves are connected into a network that is blockchained, which means that each individual member of the unit has got a code written into it that is an impression of the unit at that moment. No one can break into the node on the whole. That's what makes blockchain, and this is not an advocate for getting into blockchain systems of finance, but the reason they're so secure is the blockchaining and the way it handles codes is that you can't really hack into the system, because if you hack into one unit and alter that one, it is immediately out of sync with all the other units blockchained, and it becomes isolated. And on that point, those 5,000 homes are in turn interconnected to the next neighborhood and the next, and so on, as Jeremy Rifkin puts it, all the way across to the basically the ends of continental shelves, so to speak, in systems of overlapping networks. And you can isolate any network if there's a problem. If there's an attack, you can isolate it without affecting the others until you can deal with the problem.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's Now, let me ask another sort of devil's advocate question. This may be a project for your next book or one of your next projects, but one of the things that I thought was kind of missing was the not just Marx, but the 19th and early 20th century critique of society, sort of in general, of the sociologists and the psychologists and the philosophers who in that period began to rethink, I think, a lot of important stuff. And that probably maybe it's too tangential, but is tangentially connected with the whole idea of consumerism. And so,
Mm.
any thoughts about that in terms of how this fits into a larger discussion of the topic of your book?
Well, first of all, a mea culpa, you're absolutely right. I found one of the greatest challenges of the book was what to leave out. What to put in was easy. What to leave out was a lot harder. And in terms of the sociologists, I focused mostly on, for example, Bowling Alone.
Yeah.
I can't remember his name right now, but the book Bowling Alone, which was brilliant because it's all about how our present lifestyle under the terms of globalized capitalism has really significantly eroded our social capital.
Yeah.
And so I go on to argue that embracing the worldview that would support the natural capitalism approach to the economy would simultaneously the best way to reinvigorate our economies and restore social capitalism. Um, is there an opportunity to go back and talk about some of those late 18th and early 20th century sociologists and philosophers in their early criticisms? Yes, absolutely. And I've been thinking of doing it. And I've been thinking of doing it in the context of a more detailed discussion of what the supporting narrative or worldview would actually look like. The worldview that would support a natural capitalist economy built on the infrastructure that Rifkin outlines in his books. So that probably will be my next book, and I'm just right now kind of gathering together my ideas for how to organize it. You get a kind of like a bare bones structure in your mind, and then you start filling in the details. And at some point, you're ready to begin writing, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good. I'm glad that you didn't see that as some kind of crazy vision of my own, but
No,
because I'm trying to think through a lot of that stuff too, just in terms of the whole general idea of qualitative research and trying to rethink that and in more general ways a general critique of kind of Cartesian dualism and those kind of things. And so I'm working on that sort of from a different angle, not from and I think it's very fascinating, but very challenging to sort out and to find the connections and the disconnections between
no kidding.
all those people for me right now. So,
And
uh,
on that point, if there's anyone you think I really should look at, please send me an email and put some of those names in there. And
well, I will.
I'm at that point now where I'm sort of collecting my research materials together.
Yeah, one book that I will recommend right now. I mean, I think Consciousness and Society by H. Stewart Hughes is, and I will write this up for you. But I think that's a very interesting book because he looks at the people around Paris and that era and their impact. But and another one which is kind of would fit in, but I haven't reread this in a long time. But it's called The Machine in the Garden, and it's written about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution by Leo Marx, who was at Harvard at the time. And my remembrance of this is one of the things that he does. I think Leo Marx is probably an early, what they call an Americanist. And so
Mhm.
it's sort of American literature and American history combined. And so he does this really interesting idea of looking at kind of the metaphors that impacted our understanding of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So those,
Another person I've been looking at recently in that vein who was active in the early to the mid 20th century, I think, or in probably into the early 70s, was Lewis Mumford.
oh yes,
And he also was
sure.
very rich in his multidisciplinary approach to relying a bit on history and sociology and anything else. And yeah, so I was reading Lewis Mumford recently, The Myth of the Machine.
Yes,
Uh, yeah, and I think
me
that was one
too.
of a series of 3 books.
Yes, yes. I'm trying to get through all of those right now too.
Oh, amazing.
Yes, yes, yes. So, well, this has been, I think, a very fruitful conversation. And if we probably started about this time, we're maybe a little around a half hour, but we can chat for a little bit more. But anything else that you would like to leave the audience with um, as we sort of pull this to an end?
Well, I think it's important to point out to the audience that if you get a chance to read the book, the emphasis is really on what I sometimes call narratives and or sometimes worldview. I make the argument in the book that we see the world through a narrative, through a worldview, and um, there's nothing about our behavior and there's nothing about the future that's carved in stone. It's all a matter of the choices we make. But the choices you make tend to be shaped by your values and our beliefs, which are all part of this worldview. And so the burden of the book is really to make that argument and the argument that changing our worldview therefore becomes the essential first step to achieving sustainability, any hope of sustainability, because we really need to re-examine the way we see ourselves in relation to each other and the natural world. And that's why the next book is going to be filling in a lot more of the detail about what that that worldview would look like that would sustain support and sustain natural capitalism.
Yeah, well, I think let's talk just a little bit more about that because my one of my concerns is how to do that. I mean, I think we have, I'm saying this as you and I together, all of us who are interested in these kinds of things, we have two challenges. One is to get it out to our natural constituency, I guess, which is the academic community, because that's kind of the way I've been, like you have been sort of trained to think and work. But I think the
Yeah,
other problem is how do we get this down to the neighborhood level? Uh, how
yeah.
do, how do we engage in those kinds of conversations with our next door neighbors, with the local papers, which of course are dying, which is a sad piece, at least in the United States, it seems to be the case. And so we have that local communication level, which I think is very, very challenging in terms of how to address. And it's not because we have to simplify things to the point that they become simplistic, because I think the average person is capable of dealing with that, but it's finding a way to get those conversations begun. And anything we can do along those lines, I think is, and if you have any ideas about that, I would.
Well, I have a few thoughts, and this is not going to be there's nothing systematic about my remarks to come, but there's a lot of things I've been thinking about in connection with that, and I'd like to at least mention some of them. One of them is you're absolutely right. People are not stupid, and I think one of the reasons that people have become uh, disrespectful and suspicious of authorities, they're rather tired of being talked down to by technocrats and experts and the people are more than willing and able to understand if you will talk to them like they are responsible adults. And it's time that we started talking to one another like that. On the other hand, another point here, clearly there we are at a crucial juncture in society. It's clearly visible in the United States. The tensions are manifest here in Canada as well, and in Europe, and elsewhere in the world, with people sort of going off into their tribes.
Mm,
What I mean by that is, in the United States, the obvious example would be, I'm a Republican and that person over there is a Democrat, and there's not much willingness to talk to one another anymore. So it becomes a real challenge to find ways to bridge that gap and have us not perceive each other as enemies anymore, but as people facing a set of challenges that we can only tackle collectively. It goes to our shared interest. I don't have a magic bullet for that, but I do think it begins with being willing to listen to the other person first. Too often, I used to tell my students this, whenever you're in a conversation with others and it's around some issue that we're talking about here in class, let's say it's a scholarly issue or an academic issue or a normative issue or whatever. Have you ever noticed sometimes the other person is kind of shuffling their feet and humming and hawing, and then they just jump in? They were never listening to you at all. The
mm,
first thing you said that tweaked their interests, they immediately became defensive. And from that point on, they were actually thinking about what they were going to say to you, and then they jumped in. Let's not be that person. Let's listen to the other person. You don't have to respond to everything, but hear as much of it and try to understand as much of it as you can, and then respond. So I think I'm hearing blah, 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 and then ask some probative questions. And then once they're aware that you're willing to listen to them, maybe they will be willing to listen to you as well.
yeah.
That's my approach.
No, I think it's a good one. And a colleague a long time ago, Judy Kyle, who was involved in philosophy of children in Montreal, always had she'd have student-led discussions, and she trained the students in sixth grade to basically raise their hand, raise their finger like so, and take a note, and then listen. And then she would make sure that people got called on more or less the order, and they had their note, and so they could listen to at least the first person that was talking fairly attentively. So,
Yeah.
uh, well, thank you so much, Wayne, for this. It has been very enjoyable to have you on the podcast, and we'll see if we can continue these. I've got uh, another one scheduled shortly, yet in January. I hope to have maybe 3 or 4 more in January yet. So, um,
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you for having me, Mort. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about the book, and it was nice seeing you again. It's been a while.
Yes, it
Um,
has.
I don't remember exactly which, was it New Jersey?
No,
Montclair?
I think the last one was at ICPIC in Vancouver.
Oh, at UBC. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, that was a while ago. Yeah. Okay. 2016 or something like that.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm gonna push the stop recording button now, and
Okay.
then we can talk for a second. Yeah.